Yeah, that's so insightful. And I think that ties really nicely into my next question, which is, you know, there's this there are these discussions happening where it's whether on the defense side, kind of like on a microcosmic level, for example, in Okinawa, is saying, well, having all of these U.S. bases here actually isn't helping our defense. It's actually painting a big target on our back if hostilities were to break out. So that's just one example, but there are some who think that there's a case to be made for Japan maybe pulling back a bit from the United States, especially given its recent political dysfunction, for example, in Congress, whether it's the difficulty in confirming ambassadorships or whether it's some other issue. So in your estimation, given what's happening now, do you believe that there are really strong arguments to be made for Japan sticking to and trying to strengthen the alliance, or do you think it's time for Japan to start hedging its bets?
Well, I think the two are not mutually exclusive. I think that it's
Mm,
possible for Japan to try to strengthen the relationship with the United States on the one hand, while at the same time trying to strengthen its own uh, capabilities.
hmm
And I think probably that's what's being done right now. Um, a lot of people um, say that Japan is kind of waking up to realities in terms of the dangerous environment it's in. And people point first to North Korea and the missile development and nuclear development.
hmm
Secondly, to China, especially with regard to Senkaku Islands and on the territorial side, but also economic sanctions. And also more recently with Ukraine, and some people saying, well, today's Ukraine is tomorrow's Taiwan, and Japan needs to be ready. So, a lot of people point to those three um, uh, environmental factors as the reasons behind Japan's decision to significantly increase its defense expenditures and to allow for strike capabilities and to take a more active posture in terms of military security. That's all true, but at the same time, I do think another factor is the perception in Japan, especially since 2016, the question of whether the United States can be relied upon to the extent that Japan has relied on the United States. So that I think is a fourth factor, and in many ways, maybe the most important factor behind Japan's perception that it needs to increase its own defense capabilities. And
hmm
ever since I can certainly remember back to the Persian Gulf War days when Americans were saying, boots on the ground, show the flag. Japan needs to not only engage in financial diplomacy or dollar diplomacy, however you want to call it, just providing $13 billion for the war effort. You need
Yeah.
to show your people.
hmm
And so, from the standpoint of those Americans who have been advocating that the relation between Japan and the United States on the security side be comparable to the relation between the United States and Britain, for example,
hmm
I think there have been many people, especially in the Republican Party, that have been advocating this from the U.S. side towards Japan.
hmm
So, from the standpoint of these people, the developments of Japan are quite positive, and and I do think that Japan, given the dangerous environment it's in, it does um, um, it behooves Japan to strengthen its defense capabilities. I think um, in many ways, I think the post-war period. It's almost, I guess, 80 years now since the end of World War II. Next year, we're
hmm
coming up to the 80th anniversary, but I think the first, I'd say 40 to 50 to 60 years, Japan has been so traumatized by the results of World War II that there's been a sense of not wanting to uh, engage in war again, which is
hmm
understandable, but also along with that, the notion that rely on the United States. Don't have another military buildup in Japan because of past mistakes. So I think with generational change and with time having passed, and also with these four factors that I mentioned, that Japan clearly is now on the path towards having a greater defense capability.
Mhm.
But that doesn't preclude the notion of trying to enhance the defense cooperation with the United States.
Absolutely. And yet, you know, you spoke to us about the Republican Party. It feels like the Republican Party today is very different than it was under, the traditional standard bearer of, say, for example, Ronald Reagan. And there is this more transactional element that has been seen in recent U.S. diplomacy, and I wonder how that might affect the calculus.
Well, that's why I say, 2016 was a point where I think many people in Japan started to rethink the
Mm,
security relationship with the United States, because until that point, I think you're right that, um, well, in the post-war period, especially, during the Eisenhower period, with the Cold War, it was very clear that the U.S. and Japan were, at least on a government-to-government level. I mean, within Japan, there were a lot of, demonstrations against the renewal of the Security Treaty in 1960 and so forth.
yeah.
But clearly, Japan was on the in the U.S. camp in the Cold War.
Hmm.
But but the notion was always that the United States will provide the nuclear umbrella and
Hmm.
also provide for the defense of Japan if Japan is attacked. And now I have to say though that, I mean, I don't want to appear to be too partisan, because I think actually Barack Obama, when he was president, when he said we're drawing this, bright red line in Syria, if they use chemical biological weapons, then that's it.
Yeah,
Well, he didn't,
he
despite the
didn't.
fact that they had crossed the red line. And also, he went out of his way to say the United States can no longer be the policeman of the world.
Hmm.
Now, my own personal view is that in reality, that's true, but there's no reason why the President of the United States has to say that to, kind of strike fear into our allies. So I think that it did start more with, I mean,
Hmm.
here's the thing. I think that the George W. Bush administration went overboard in trying to, attack Iraq without finding any weapons of mass destruction. And I think partly in reaction to that, the Obama people and the American public, I think, said, these endless wars, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, these are not things that we should be engaged in, especially since we've got problems domestically in the United States, economic problems, social problems, medical problems, opioid addiction, alcoholism, all sorts of problems in the United States. Why should we be wasting our money on these other countries? So, I mean, that's kind of a view that I think I think actually in large part a response to the uh, the kind of wars that the Bush administration was engaged in, and,
Hmm.
and Obama kind of reflected that. And then it's been kind of reinforced with now President-elect Trump saying, Syria, it's not our problem. Let them take care of it. It's not our problem. We're not going to get engaged. And so, but to get back to your question, it's clearly true that the Republican Party now, which is pretty much a Trump party, is quite different from the Republican Party of the Reagan and Bush years. And I think that many people in Japan, and especially in the LDP, are still kind of, wedded to and think fondly back to the Reagan Bush years, where they felt that
Hmm.
Republicans stood for free trade and for kind of anti-communism, aggressive foreign policy abroad, against communism, but also against terrorism. And so I think that the current Republican Party is quite different from the Republican Party that many of the Japanese came to love and know.
Hmm. Yeah, and the perceptions of Americans to Japan or vice versa may have changed as well. But there, what has underpinned the alliance for so long has been these relations between the two peoples. And um, I remember that I recall that you made a considerable donation to Fulbright in Japan, partly in out of concern in that those people to people exchanges were on the decline. And so I wonder, how do you see, we're in this kind of topsy-turvy world now, but how do you see the relations between Americans and Japanese? What's the current, how do you see it today, and how do you see it unfolding in the near future?
So, next year will be the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, and certainly the relationship between U.S. and Japan has, really prospered and has been very strong and mutually beneficial over the years. Um, but one area in which I do have a concern is that the number of students from Japan studying in the United States has really declined in
Hmm.
recent years. The peak was 1997, when there were more than 47,000 Japanese students studying in the United States for at least 1 year on the college level. That was the most of any country, and that was 1997. Now I think Japan is about number 12, and
Hmm.
it's down to about 11,500. And so China, India, South Korea, Vietnam. I
Hmm.
think Nigeria just surpassed Japan.
Say wow.
Um, South Korea, with less than one half the population of Japan, has more than three times the number of students studying in the United States.
Mm.
And there are a number of reasons that can be cited for this, and it would take an hour to go over the probably 20 different factors. But one of the factors, not the only, but one of the factors is the how expensive it is to study in the United States.
Mm.
I was at a conference last year in Tokyo where it was pointed out. Uh, Columbia University was sponsoring this conference. The president of University of Tokyo, was also there at the conference. It was pointed out by a Japanese professor at Columbia who used to teach at the University of Tokyo that the tuition differential between University of Tokyo and Columbia University now for undergraduates is 17 times. I think the tuition at Columbia is something like $85,000 or so. I think at Tokyo University is like, $40,000. So in any case, that price differential is a huge factor. Now, that doesn't explain even half of the reasons, I think, because this price factor is something that affects all countries, not only Japan. So despite the fact that the United States education, the higher education is so expensive, despite that fact, there are lots and lots of non-Americans coming to the United States to study. So that's only one factor.
Mm.
But another big factor, I think, is that, and this is was pointed out by Drew Faust, the president of Harvard, when she visited Japan in 2010. She said that Harvard University had done a study over the previous 10 years of foreign students studying at Harvard, and they looked at the top 10 countries that had sent students to study at Harvard. Of the top 10, they found that nine had more students studying at Harvard at the end of that 10-year study. I think it went up to 2009. I think it was from 1999 to 2009. But I think she said that nine of the 10 countries had more students studying at Harvard. The only exception was Japan.
Mm.
Japan had gone from 150 some students to about 105 students. China had doubled.
Mm.
South Korea had tripled. She said at that time there were only five undergraduates from Japan at Harvard
Mm.
College. But her conclusion was, after spending several days in Japan talking to many educators and especially presidents of Japanese universities, and I went to a number of the meetings with her, but her conclusion was that Japan, unlike many other countries, especially other countries in Asia, like China or South Korea or Singapore or Indonesia, Vietnam, that
Mm.
students from Japan who study in the United States, even if they go to a selective college, even if they do very well, they're not rewarded in Japan. In some cases, they're penalized for having spent time abroad. And so, from her point of view, the Japanese students were only acting in their rational self-interest. They were acting in ways in which they were going to be, if they're going to be penalized, if they're not going to be rewarded, why go abroad? And
Mm.
now that's changed. I think over the last 10 to 15 years, things have changed. And so parents, especially mothers in Japan, are now more receptive than in the past to allowing their children, especially sons, to take a risk and go abroad. So things have changed a bit. And the other thing that's changed, I think, is that certain Japanese business people, like Masayoshi Son of
Mhm.
SoftBank and um, the president of Yanai of Uniqlo, they
Mhm.
provided scholarships, and also recently the Sasagawa Foundation also produced scholarships to give full scholarships to Japanese high school students who uh, uh, qualify to attend certain universities in the United States or in England. And so this is a major development. I think the total number altogether of these three programs is probably fewer than 100 students per year, but still, it is I think significant that there is a cadre of Japanese high school students who are going to study at selective colleges in the United States. But from an overall perspective, looking at the numbers overall, the number of students from Japan studying in the United States has really declined, and
Mhm.
that's one of the reasons I made a contribution to Fulbright to try to encourage both Japanese students who want to study abroad and Americans who would like to come to go to Japan to study.
So do you think the US government or US academia writ large is doing enough to facilitate the other way to get Americans to go to Japan? To
Mm,
the same degree, Japan
yeah.
is making these efforts, but are those being matched on the US side? Or what do you think the US could do to increase um, besides, the JET program, which has, been around for quite a while and has a strong following, but are there other ways that the government can help to get
Well, the
Americans over?
JET program, I think, is really one of the most successful exchange programs that Japan has undertaken, and
Hmm.
the long-term effects, I think, have been, quite positive for Japan and
Hmm.
for other countries. So that's really a very positive success model. I think that it's difficult for governments to do very much because so much has to do with the content of the education and the financial
Hmm.
requirements. And um, for Japanese going to the United States, the content is very attractive, but the price is very high.
Hmm.
Americans going to Japan, I think that the price isn't that high. The content varies a lot. I think that to really get full benefit from studying at Japanese universities, I think in most cases, not in all cases, in most cases, it's difficult unless you speak Japanese.
Hmm.
Um, Now, Japanese universities over the last, say, 10 to 20 years have increased course offerings in English,
Hmm.
but still the number of universities and all the number of courses in which are taught in English is still rather limited.
Hmm.
And so in terms of course offerings and what students can benefit by going to Japanese universities, unless they're in a very specific topic in which Japan is quite advanced, like in disaster prevention or seismology or certain areas of public health or I mean or say railroad management. I think Japan is light years ahead of the United States when it comes to the Shinkansen, the bullet train. I just saw recently some figure that the bullet train, the average length of the lateness, how late the Shinkansen is in any given year is 54 seconds. So, I mean, it's like comparing that to Amtrak in the United States. If you
Right.
want to learn about railroad management, I think, going to Japan is much better than studying in the United States.
Absolutely.
But but if you think more broadly, I think that the course offerings probably in the United States for Japanese, is far better than the other way around. And in the
Hmm.
Fulbright program, for instance, I think there's something like 4 or 5 Japanese who were Fulbright recipients who studied in the United States who later got the Nobel Prize
Mm.
in science, I think in physics or chemistry or medical science. So, um, yeah, so I think that, put it another way, I think if Japanese universities increased their quality of course instruction, especially in English, then that would be a way to attract more Americans studying in Japan. And you look at these, Times, the Times of London and other surveys of the quality of universities around the world. Unfortunately, Japan, doesn't rate very high. I think
Mm.
University of Tokyo, Kyoto University, and Waseda and Keio generally rank, in the top 100 or top 200 maybe. But, you know, I mean, the
Mm.
universities in the United States and Europe and increasingly in Asia, I think Chinese, Indian, Singaporean universities are really increasing in terms of their ranking level, partly because they do offer courses in English, and partly because they have more, scholars from around the world who come to teach.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Um, Glenn, I'm conscious of your time. I have so many more questions I wanted to ask you, but perhaps as we get down to the last few minutes here, um, I'm wondering, heading into 2025, what milestones or developments you will be looking at as we enter into the new year?
Well, both countries have uncertainties on the political side.
Mm.
I think everyone's watching. I'm here in Washington, D.C., so every day, people are talking about the new appointments or nominees that President-elect Trump has named, and wondering whether these people will be confirmed by the Senate, and also what policies Trump administration is going to follow, especially because President-elect Trump is someone who talks a lot, says a lot in his speeches and his interviews and so forth. To what extent he's actually going to implement what he
Mm.
says, nobody knows for sure. And so there's a lot of uncertainty about what specific policies he's going to implement. For instance, on immigration, I mean, he talks
Mm.
about, deporting, mass deportation. And, well, that's going to be 11 million, 13 million, or 1 million. Not clear, I
Yeah.
mean, it's not clear exactly what he will want to do in his actions to follow what he has said he's going to do in words, but also even if he tries to do what he says he wants to do, to what extent the legal system in the United States will allow him to do that is another
Mm.
question.
Mm.
So, it's not clear exactly what's going to be done. And the other question too is to what extent is he going to focus on domestic policy versus foreign policy?
Mm.
Now, I mean, immigration would be considered, I think, a domestic policy in this regard. But he's got a lot of things he wants to do. Presumably, cutting taxes for individuals, for corporations. Cutting back on regulations. There are lots of things. I mean, he wants to get rid of the Department of Education. Presumably, he
Right.
wants to get rid of the deep state. He's got this DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, that Elon Musk and Ramaswamy are supposed to cut, trillions from the budget of the United States and cut personnel and cut agencies. To what extent, that's going to actually come about is not clear. So on the US, and so on the domestic policy side, there are a lot of questions. And on the foreign policy side, I mean, he's made a lot of statements about how he's going to, immediately fix the Ukraine-Russia problem or the Israel-Hamas problem. Not clear what he's going to do or how that's going to play out. So on the U.S. side, there's a lot of uncertainty.
Mm.
On the Japanese side, as you well know, with Prime Minister Kishida stepping down and now Prime Minister Ishiba
Mm.
uh, facing the budget in the March, April timeframe next year, and then with
Mhm.
the upper house election coming up in around July of next year, a
Yeah.
lot of uncertainty. I mean, some people believe that he may not be a very long-term prime minister. Big question is whether he will um, be the prime minister when the upper house election is going to be held next July. And then if he were to have to step down, then who would uh, step up to replace him? And last
Mm,
time around, as you know, in the LDP presidential election, there were 9 candidates, more than ever in recent past, at least.
mhm,
And so and again with Ishiba as well, to what extent he's going to focus on domestic policy and to what extent on foreign policy. And because he was Minister of Defense and because he's and a lot of people around him are Minister of Defense people, um, a lot of people think he's going to put a lot of emphasis on foreign policy, but not clear exactly what he will want to do. I mean, he said things, like revising the status of forces agreement between the United States and Japan, or
mhm,
advocating for a Asian NATO. These don't seem to be proposals that are being widely applauded by people
mhm,
around him. So
mhm,
not clear where those are going to go. So there's a lot of uncertainty in both countries. Um, I mean, thankfully, right now, I don't think that there are huge problems between the U.S. and Japan. I mean, there's some small problems like the U.S. Steel, Nippon Steel issue, but there aren't huge problems between the U.S. and Japan. In fact, in many respects, I think from the standpoint of both countries, on the military security side, on the political side, and on the economic side, there's a lot of need for cooperation. And
mhm,
so I'm encouraged that, regardless of the political uncertainties in the two countries, that there's there's enough going on where the two sides feel it's in their own self-interest to cooperate with each other. And
mhm.
so I'm hopeful that that the cooperation will outweigh any conflicts or problems that might rise.
Well, that is a very encouraging note on which to end this very insightful interview. Glenn, I understand that you have some travel coming up, so we would like to wish you safe travels
Thank you.
and all the best during the holiday season and the new year. And with your indulgence, I hope we can have you back again sometime in the very near future. So thank you again for your time today.
Well, thank you very much, Terrace, and I want to commend you on your program. I think you've had some really interesting speakers, present company excluded, and you're providing a real service by interviewing interesting people and providing insights that might not otherwise be available. So really want to thank you and encourage you in continuing and expanding your program. Thank
Thanks
you.
for that. That's so generous. Thank you very much.